Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to ASPI's podcast. I'm Peter Jennings, Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, beaming to you live from my luxurious production studio here at home. And today we're going to be talking about the ASPI book that was launched last Saturday after COVID-19, Australia and the World Rebuild, which John Coyne and I edited. I'll introduce my guests to you soon, but I just wanted to sort of set the context for this particular publication, which was around about mid-March. ASPI took the decision to work from home as a result of the virus. And I thought that as a forward-thinking organisation, as an organisation that is here to think about strategy and policy choices for government, we needed to get our own thinking in order to talk about the policy issues that the Australian government and indeed the broader region would face when we start to come out of the pandemic. So I said to my team, I'd like everyone to be thinking about their areas of specialisation and to produce roughly 2,000 word studies setting out how they think the pandemic is going to impact on their particular areas of research interest and what the implications would be for the Australian government. And the result of that is this book, about 140 odd pages. What I can tell you is we're also, because think tankers like to do this, we're also now working on volume 2, which Michael Shoebridge and Lisa Sharland will edit probably for a June timeframe with a bit of a theme around Australia's wider region and the implications of the virus for countries and organisations and interests in the wider region. So keep a lookout for that one. So what we're going to do is I'm going to have a conversation with 3 of the contributing authors to the current volume. Robert Glasser, who's Visiting Fellow at ASPI. Robert, good to see you. Fergus Hanson, Director of the International Cyber Policy Centre. Hi there, Fergus. And Huong Le Thu, Senior Analyst, particularly researching on Southeast Asian issues. Great to have the 3 of you here. Once we've had a bit of a chat amongst ourselves, I'm going to throw open to questions. I can see we've already got one up from the audience, so please put your questions down. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can. If there's an overrun, then my suggestion would be perhaps think about emailing the particular author that you'd like to talk with, and we'll see if we can get some answers to you that way. But let's get through as many as we can today. So first I'm going to go to Fergus. You produced a paper on politics and values, how COVID-19 accelerates the tendency to value-centred competition between the great powers. And Fergus, you talked about a period of sustained competition between the great powers and the need for the democracies to rediscover their mojo, which I thought was a great phrase. Can you, for our audience, share with us the sort of the essence of what your chapter was arguing, Fergus? Let's start that way.
Well, thanks, Peter, and thanks everyone for joining us during your work from home lunch breaks. The argument that I mount is that COVID-19 has accelerated 3 big trends. It's raised questions about the CCP system of authoritarianism's suitability for global leadership. If the CCP has been projecting this idea that it's an alternative global leader to the United States, that it's a leader of the global South, but how can it do that when that system was responsible for the initial cover-up of a deadly and highly contagious virus that's now caused over hundreds of thousands of deaths, tens of millions of people to be made unemployed, and untold millions going to be forced into poverty. So there was that big question mark, I think, that's been accelerated through the spread of the virus. The second big trend was, I think, the sustainability of the current wave of Western populism. So we've known for some time that publics around the world are deeply frustrated with Western elites. We've seen plummeting trust in governments, in public institutions, and all of that, I think, due to some fundamental changes that have taken place in our societies. Loss of job security, the erosion of community organisations, traditional religious institutions, traditional media. And into that vacuum has stepped populism, which is with its sort of denial of reality. But really that's a temporary salve in the sense that it offers nothing in the way of solutions to those fundamental problems. So if you look at the governments that try to treat COVID-19 as a part of the culture wars, it will devastating consequences for the publics and for leaders like Boris Johnson, who was boasting a couple of weeks ago about shaking hands with COVID victims, very nearly a deadly personal toll. So I think counterintuitively, what we're going to see is a reaction against that populism and a shift in our domestic politics towards a politics centred on values, morals and ethics. And I think there's a whole burgeoning literature on this. I think there's elements of Scott Morrison's prime ministership that have tapped into this type of intuition, notwithstanding the fact that he's easily dismissed as this sort of Scotty from marketing. I think there are actually some interesting intellectual underpinnings behind his success, and so I think we're going to start seeing that playing out in Western politics. The third trend I identify is a period of heightened competition with the CCP. And superficially, you can see that the propaganda war has entered a new era. The gloves have come off and we've gone from the sort of, glowing pieces we get in our paid supplements in our Fairfax newspapers of the China Daily to much more Russian-style techniques, which are trying to muddy the waters, sow disinformation, create conspiracy theories and outright lies in the information environment. But I think at a deeper level, there's been a real rupture in policy towards policy thinking about China all over the world. So we've gone from this era where there was a consensus amongst China experts that China would peacefully integrate into the Western system, the existing international system, to one where I think there's been both generational change and a whole series of actions that have basically turned that thinking on its head. We've gone from an easy integration sort of assumption to one where we're really starting to see China as wanting to change the existing international system and do that in quite a disruptive way. We've seen arbitrary arrests of citizens, coercive diplomatic methods, ambit claims made for the whole South China Sea. All of these sorts of actions that I think have called into question, the way that China will rise, not just here in Australia, but all through our region. And even we're starting to see it in Europe with German industry calling for changes, and the UK recently saying, it can't go back to business as usual. To me, all of that boils down to, what's that competition with China going to look like? And to me, it points, we've got to think through how do we frame that competition so that it doesn't point us down the direction of escalating conflict and ultimately, a situation like regime change, which is going to be, drive us in a very bad direction. To me, a better way of framing it, rather than looking at a sort of a Cold War kind of framing, is to frame it around the differences between our two societies, and around morals and values. And if we do that, I think it's much easier to differentiate what it is that is great about free societies versus authoritarian societies. And there's a number of, and I think it plays into the logical future trajectory of domestic politics in democracies. There's a bunch of policy recommendations that come from that, both domestically and internationally, how we engage in international relations. But maybe I'll leave that to some follow-up questions, Peter.
Okay, Fergus, thanks. It's a very big canvas that you're painting there. A question that comes to my mind is, why do you think China internationally has sort of flipped the switch to a very angry, combative type of rhetoric? This is called wolf warrior diplomacy. We've seen Chinese diplomats all of a sudden start to acquire Twitter accounts and to get, quite personal and quite angry. I mean, this is obviously a conscious choice that's been made in Beijing to take this type of approach, but to me, in some ways, I think it could be very counterproductive to Chinese interests. Do you have any thoughts about why, at this particular moment, that seems to have been the decision that has been taken?
I guess I look at that on two levels. I mean, I think the immediate decision right now to pivot to Russian-style propaganda methods is really because out of desperation, because this is so existential for the CCP. If you're trying to project yourself as an alternative global leader and you've covered up something that manifestly cannot be covered up because it's a highly contagious virus that's going to cause, has caused, the entire global economy, enormous human suffering all around the world, including in countries where the CCP is trying to cultivate influence. I mean, it's an existential problem to have been right behind that cover up, not cooperating early on, not doing the best that it could to try and help the rest of the world prepare for it. So I think all of that points to an urgent demand to try and flip the narrative away from the fact that there had been a cover up to one where you try to blame others, muddy the water, and create misinformation so that lots of the public around the world is confused about where the virus actually started, or was there a cover up or not, or maybe the cover up was bigger and other countries might be responsible. So I think that's the immediate reason, but for me, but I think there's also a wider shift that we've seen. In 2015, we had Xi Jinping standing next to then President Barack Obama saying we will not militarize the South China Sea. And only a couple of months later, we get satellite imagery showing that was a barefaced lie. That to me is quite an extraordinary development. When I grew up joining the Foreign Service, you were sort of taught that, once a country sort of says what its position is on a particular issue, you broadly have to take them at their word and assume that that's the stated government policy and that's the direction they're going to head. When you've got, leaders of large countries prepared to say the opposite of what they're actually doing or going to do, then I think that's a real problem. And we saw a pivot under Xi to be much more assertive and sort of overturn this method of integration towards, disrupting and changing the system.
Yes, that was the same meeting where Xi said that China would not engage in cyber espionage against other countries, which didn't seem to last very long either. Fergus, let me turn to Huong. You had the modest topic of Southeast Asia, 10 countries, 650 million people in 2,000 words. What was the sort of essence of your chapter, Huong?
Yes, so quickly, just a few key points and invite our viewers to read the whole chapter. But I really wanted to start with the vulnerabilities of the region and show the diversity of the region before, as you said in the second chapter, I'll engage in more of geopolitics and views on the great powers and how they will emerge from this new balance of power. But the key argument I put forward is that the region is very diverse and the pandemic is unfolding in a very different way in different countries. For example, we have Vietnam, who is the first country in Southeast Asia to ease the social distancing restrictions on 23rd of April last week, and gradually going back to normal, or thinking about the normality and revival of the economy, with a very remarkable 0 deaths and only 271 cases with around 50 active cases. We have Singapore, who is now has the highest reported cases, around 18,000, but largely contained because it's largely 70-80% of them are within the foreign workers dormitories community, so it's are mild cases and not overwhelm the health system, and the death toll is still relatively low, only 18 as of today. And also started slowly thinking about easing of their circuit breaker. And for example, I don't have the time to go through all the countries. I'm happy to engage during the Q&A session, but for example, Indonesia doesn't look like it will be looking at coming back to normality anytime soon. It is actually for countries like Indonesia, Philippines, and also Myanmar and Thailand, a number of countries, we are still waiting for the further development. It can still go in many ways much worse than it is, given that the natural disasters season is coming with cyclones, typhoons, drought, and floods. So in my paper, I outline the vulnerabilities, not only related to the health crisis, but also economic crisis, but also if mishandling of them might lead to political and social unrest, and also striking very many vulnerabilities that are existent within the societies, including persisting issues like separatist movement, radical religious elements, or history of ethnic-based violence within certain corners of the region. And obviously, crises are the opportunities for any elements to take advantage of the destructive leadership and may be a reason for further chaos. So far, luckily, it's not yet such a case, but economically already Southeast Asia looks quite fragile. Most of the countries have adjusted their growth prediction. I think one of the sharpest, there are different predictions, but one of the sharpest decline is seen right now in Thailand, in the prediction suggested by a Singaporean corporate research unit that, for example, Thailand before the COVID had predicted the growth of 3%, but after COVID is somewhere minus 5.5%, which is a sharp decline. And the whole region, the average will be quite costly, around 4%, if not more, and probably it might be more depending how long the crisis will last. So the economic part is quite vulnerable.
Looks like Huong, you've frozen at the moment. That might be the chilling impact of growth figures in Asia. What I might do while we get Huong back online is go to you, Robert. Obviously, climate change was the topic of your chapter, the sort of bigger crisis that may emerge after the crisis, I guess. But one problem is COVID has kind of taken attention away from all of those things that we were so deeply focusing on just in the Australian summer and that disastrous bushfire season. But can you
hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Huong. I've just flung to Robert to get him to make his comments on his chapter, and then perhaps we'll come back to you to finish off on the growth. Robert, over to you.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, everyone, for joining, and colleagues for being here as well. Yeah, I mean, my objective in the paper was to essentially address a message, the one you just highlighted, Peter, which is that somehow that the COVID pandemic is a significant blow to efforts to address climate change on a number of levels. And I guess my starting point in the paper is to highlight that the climate threat is a much bigger and more fundamental threat. With COVID, we will have hundreds of thousands of deaths. We'll have huge economic impact, at least for a couple of years. You know, I've seen figures in the trillions of dollars ultimately. But at the end of the day, there is a return to a form of normal that maybe has changed a bit, but we do return to a sense of normality at some point. With climate change, it's a totally different situation. It's a global systemic change that will deliver very extreme impacts, increasing non-linearly. So even what we've seen in the last 10 years is not a reliable indicator of what we can expect in the next, in the decade ahead. The problems will simply get worse and worse as the climate continues to warm. There isn't a point at which you get back to normal, because the changes that happen are systemic changes that, at least in human timescales, are irreversible. We can respond to a pandemic and manage and recover, develop vaccines and so on. But in the case of climate change, these changes, once they've taken effect, are irreversible, and they get worse and worse. So that was one point. The second observation I wanted to make was just that, if you look at, there are a number of realities that guarantee that this issue and the response to it will remain both prominent and important in the years ahead. The first is that reality of disasters. As countries experience more and more disasters, simultaneous disasters on greater scales that have cascading impacts on society, this issue becomes more prominent. It becomes more like a pandemic where you see the results and you implement transformational changes across society. As the pain and the obvious impact of climate change increases, governments are going to have to respond, as we've seen in the recent bushfires with the Prime Minister's recent unprecedented changes he's proposing, both in the Australian Defence Forces and in the ability for the federal government to declare national emergency and moving forward in unprecedented ways, as matching the unprecedented scale of the disaster. So that's going to continue and accelerate. And so attention politically will have to focus on this. The second is renewable energies, which is, of course, the key response to climate change. And the economics of renewable energies are more and more compelling. We need the deployment of new technologies and improvements to accelerate, but ultimately this energy transformation from fossil fuels to renewables is, like climate change, irreversible, just because the economics is so compelling. It's already competitive in many places with respect relative to coal and to fossil fuels, either both new plants and existing operation of plants. So this is a trend that's going to continue. And for those two reasons, the view that some have expressed that this is delivering a fatal blow or some sort of significant blow to multilateralism, because of the hoarding, because of the attacks on the WHO for allegedly going along with China, for various reasons, I think is not going to play out. Certainly, there will be countries who will look at their supply chains and want to reduce their vulnerability. But these many global problems, whether it's preventing future pandemics or climate change, can't be solved effectively by individual countries. So whereas there will be some casualties or impacts on multilateralism, in other areas, I think that support will continue. And we're seeing this already, maybe not including the United States and Australia, but with many other countries now talking about collaborating on vaccine technology and so on. Disease surveillance will be a key area of work, and climate change mitigation will also continue after the pandemic.
Rob, thank you. Well, I can see we're actually piling up a good long list of questions, so there's not going to be any trouble in taking this presentation through to 1 o'clock. But I just briefly want to ask one more question of each of you before we get to the questions, and that is to say, imagine yourself in a situation where you are in a lift with the Prime Minister, appropriately socially distancing, of course, but you've got, let's say it's the Sydney Commonwealth Parliamentary Offices, you've got about 20 floors in which you can put your pitch to the PM about what the policy consequences should be from the chapters that you've written. Fergus, over to you. What would be your message to the PM about policy that he should be thinking about today?
Well, I guess I would say one domestic policy, one international suggestion. On the domestic front, I think we have to, if we're going to compete with China around and the CCP around values, we have to really sharply delineate the differences between the two approaches of authoritarianism and the approach that we take here in Australia. And I think that means we have to live what we preach. And if you take an example like the introduction of surveillance tools in Australia, there's a tendency to, for law enforcement and others to want to adopt the types of technologies we see being rolled out in China because it's easier, it's quicker to solve crimes, it's more cost effective. But I think that does, if you compare that with our values, I think there's a sharp contradiction. We need to be really careful when we adopt these types of tools to make sure that we're adopting them in a way that is conforms with our values in the society that we live in. So in democracies, government should trust the people to do the right thing the majority of the time. So to put them under surveillance and any encroachment on that surveillance is a sort of violation of that agreement between government and the people. In authoritarian states, of course, it's the exact opposite. The state lives in fear of the people and wants to keep them controlled and under surveillance. So I think we need to be really careful and really clear in articulating any of these tools that we do introduce, the protections we have in place and the way that we are distinguishing ourselves from authoritarian states. On the international front, I think the problem that we made in the past when we had this sort of optimistic view of China's rise, that we looked at transgressions of behaviour as sort of anomalies rather than patterns of behaviour, and that allowed ourselves to be picked off individually. So we had this view that we were the only country in the world in the sin bin, and we had to do something to patch up the relationship with China before we could get on with business as usual. When in fact that was a global pattern and we were all being picked off bilaterally. So if you look at the arrest that Canada executed against the Huawei CFO, they arrested innocent Canadians in retaliation, and Australia didn't see the connection between the arrest of innocent Canadians and our arrest of our own innocent Australians in China. So we didn't immediately join the protest to try and push back against that action. I think what we need to do is be far more collective in our pushback. So if we see transgressions that of unacceptable behaviour, arbitrary arrests, coercive methods, aggressive behaviour, we need to push back as a group and as a collective rather than allowing ourselves to be picked off individually.
Thanks, Fergus. That's very interesting. Huong, you've just got into the lift with the PM. What's your pitch to him?
Well, yes. So I would pitch that the region will emerge from this crisis in a very different ways, in different conditions and in different time frame, as I explained, the diversity of it. Therefore, Australians' policy towards the region must be tailored to individual countries, and because they will emerge from this crisis in very different conditions. But largely, I would propose a strategy based on three phases of the recovery, which is based on phase of resolution, recovery, and reinvention. So we are now still thinking immediately of resolution, for example, so immediate help in terms of on the health front. So for example, if the region is short of personal protective equipment, health equipment, or even medical staff, or test kits, if it's something that Australia coming out of this crisis earlier and is able to provide, that would be a start. And for example, Indonesia is in severe need for tests and other equipment, and obviously a secure and stable region is critical for Australians' security and safety. So that's the first one. The second one is a longer term. So we're recovering from also economically, but we all still have to look to do research on this very virus and vaccine. So not all of the countries in the region have the research capacity. Australia is one of really forefront with CSIRO testing the vaccines at the moment. So sharing this best practices, sharing the research outcomes, and even potentially vaccines would be very much a big contribution. And the recovery includes medical and scientific work, but also economic revival. So for example, Australia, I think, will have a little bit more of bandwidth than some of the currently the great powers, US or China, to think about multilateral frameworks, how the world economic recover globally together through multilateralism, through collective efforts, and Australia being the big and advocate for multilateralism can play an active role in the regional new framework coming out with the revival policies. And finally, the reinvention, which is further down the path. So a lot of those economies that I've started saying depend on low-skill manufacturing. An immediate response to it, because obviously that will be hampered by this pandemic, is, for example, Japan is moving a lot of its manufacturing to Southeast Asia. Australia doesn't have to think in a similar terms, but it has a great role in, for example, helping to reinvent the economies and reform them, not to be so dependent on low-skill manufacturing for anymore. For example, through digitalization and upskilling the technology. And as we have seen, this pandemic has forced us to do rapid digitalization, something that is very much in need in the region. And I know that DFAT, as well as our colleagues in cyber team, has been helping with education, cyber education. So in the form of helping the digitalization and reforming those economies in the longer term, that's the final goal.
That's very interesting, Huong. It strikes me that there's an interesting confluence of both a humanitarian imperative, but also a deep strategic interest that Australia has to want to get in to assist the countries of the region, in a much bigger and more profound way, because clearly Southeast Asia's wealth and security is a foundation stone of our own security. So there's an opportunity in this, it seems to me, that if we can develop a sort of Southeast Asian counterpart to the Pacific Step Up, I think Australia really does have a chance to dramatically improve its engagement with the region. Let me then throw to Rob. Turns out it's a solar-powered lift that you're in with the PM, Rob, so no problems there. What
intermittent energy. Yes.
What's your well, you can take the stairs at night, I guess. What's your pitch to the PM?
I would say, well, actually, I'll follow on from Huong's comment. I would say three things to the PM. The first thing I would say is that the government should prepare for the likelihood that a country in our region, in the throes of recovering and responding to a pandemic, will be struck simultaneously by a climate-related disaster. This pandemic is going to last for months, and for many months, and it is extremely likely in this period that there will be a disaster that Australia will need to respond to. And the government needs to begin preparing now, both ADF, the Australian Defence Forces, and the aid program, for the challenges that simultaneous disaster reflects operationally. For example, the traditional way of providing relief in countries affected by a disaster would be, first of all, their camps, densely populated of camps of the internally displaced, and food is distributed through those mechanisms because it's efficient in general. In a pandemic, it's dangerous. So there are different operational challenges that both the aid program and the ADF should be working through now. Secondly, I would say to the Prime Minister that even though I know the government is considering this and has already taken some measures, but we are going to, of course, need further economic stimulus packages. And the government should take this opportunity to invest, to include renewable energies in the stimulus package because of the fundamentally important role renewables will play in our future. I know the government will probably, of course, need to spread the stimulus around to other sectors as well, but the renewable sector is absolutely fundamental. We saw in 2009 in the US, the response and the recovery from the economic crisis at that time. The US invested something like $90 billion in the clean energy sector. It generated millions of jobs and resulted in the situation where now today jobs in clean energy outnumbered jobs in fossil fuels 3-1. There's a huge opportunity there to create jobs and also to make investments in things like solar farms and wind farms that don't require a 10-year commitment or a 5-year commitment. There's a shorter time frame for investments in infrastructure in those areas, which gives the government greater flexibility as well. The final thing I would say to the Prime Minister is to congratulate him on some of the unique governance mechanisms he has put in place to address the unprecedented scale of this disaster. The National Cabinet, for example, but there are other innovations in terms of communications and initiatives across jurisdictions, in terms of IT approaches like the app and so the apps that are the social distancing apps and so on. My recommendation to the Prime Minister would be that the government document those innovations that have generic application to other disasters, because climate change is increasing the frequency, severity of national scale disasters similar to what we've seen in this last bushfire season. And so we're going to need those innovations sooner than we think.
Yes, good one. I think there's a sense that, government could come out of this with a real sense of momentum behind it and greater confidence. I think the Prime Minister's already indicated that the Cabinet of the Commonwealth governments, or the Cabinet of the Federation governments, will continue in one form or another, which I think is actually a really important initiative and may, for the first time, probably since Federation, break through some of those logjams that have been created in terms of federal and state relationships. So let's go to the questions. We've got a lot, and so I think what we need to do is work through these relatively quickly. And I'm going to start at the beginning. Peter McDermott asks a question: do we need a middle power security architecture to help us navigate the international environment in a way that is sort of supplemental to the US alliance system? Huong, maybe I'll throw that one to you. What's your reaction?
I think this is, like you said, you put it in the book. I agree that this is really a critical turning point, a moment that Australia can reassess and reinterpret many of the key policy assumptions, including its security key assumptions with the alliance. I think before I write off the institutions of our alliance, I think it's normal that in the alliance relationship, one partner is stronger than another at different point of time, and that's actually showing the equality of the relationship rather than the dependent kind of dependency top down. So actually, it's good that seemingly we are at the moment emerging from this crisis so far in a better shape at the moment. I do think that there are certain needs for reforming the broader regional and global architecture. There are some obviously obsolete institutions, organizations that is normal is, but what we need rather than building new ones, which I don't also exclude, but really what we need is commitment to the being within any framework, whether it's unilateral, multilateral, how big it is, because there's no point of establishing new frameworks if we come, or any partners, any actors come in with half-hearted, and therefore we see dysfunctionality of these institutions. If, for example, major powers, the members are not either active, not paying, or overpaying, or using in any way. So really coming into the regional architecture with purpose and commitment rather than multiplying new ones. So it's good. It's a good time to review which ones serve the purpose and which ones are not serving the purpose, which ones can be reformed and which ones are not worth reforming. But I think the commitment to being in a framework of a multilateral framework is the key answer here.
Should Australia be thinking about signing up to ASEAN, Huong, and would ASEAN want us, even if we were minded to do that?
Yes, I've written quite a few about that before the COVID. I think before Australia thinks about it, I think ASEAN also needs to answer a question to itself: what purpose it's serve after the 50 years, over 50 years of existence. There is a lot of criticism there, and obviously the COVID pandemic serves as another example to point out the weaknesses of of this regional body. But to be honest, there is no other alternatives for the countries in the region. So like I said in the opening remarks, the strong ones will come out stronger and the weaker will come out weaker. So without this kind of framework, it will be even a larger disparity, and we will be living in a region with, wider development gap, and that can potentially be also a reason for instability. So I think ASEAN will still serve its purpose. It also needs to look at its own mirror and define new purposes. Whether Australia needs to be a formal member, I would say at the moment, no. It is a very active and very important partner, and it should continue to be even more engaged and even more closer partner, but not necessarily as a member, because it comes with both a lot of obligations and a lot of institutional commitment that it's not necessarily helpful for Australian engagement at this point in time.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Huong. I'm going to give Pete McChrystal's question to you, Fergus. How do we successfully navigate the uncomfortable pathway between sovereignty on the one hand and globalisation and globalised profit margins on the other?
Good question. So I think probably where my instinct on this is that we're currently on a trajectory towards overreaction on a once in 100-year event that's happened, and we're probably going to go down the pathway of doing too much around the sovereignty piece, and that's not really necessarily. I think we need to think about it, but we don't need to overreact. We have a long history of being an open trading nation and benefiting enormously from that. So I think that is the right instinct, and we shouldn't be afraid to in general revert back to that. Having said that, I think that there are clearly some areas where we do need to think very carefully about this. I don't think it's necessarily going to mean we have to have a standing set of factories that can produce medical face masks, but maybe it's more around key capabilities like telecommunications equipment, key technologies that are going to be really important for spurring future economic growth, and potentially some capacities in a selection of industries that really matter. So things like CSL, our healthcare provider, companies in Australia, a limited manufacturing base, and food security and things like that. So they're the ones I think be more a portfolio in key sectors rather than going too far overboard.
Okay, thank you. Rob, I'm going to try you with David Harvey's question about the current and midterm recession, probably turning into a depression. I think it seems likely. How is that going to impact on regional and global competition in the medium term?
Regional and global competition. Well, I think as with any depression, people will become much more internally focused on their own problems, and of course, during the next months, in any case, international travel is probably going to be one of the last restrictions removed. But I think, as with any recession, depression, I hope we avoid depression, but certainly a lot of unemployment that's lingering. I think the challenge will be investments. Challenge will be reestablishing or supporting small businesses, those that haven't already gone out of business as a result of the cash flow issues in the short term. The challenge will be if we unlock and then the pandemic accelerates again, hired employees and they have to let them go again. It's sort of a double blow that magnifies the impact, so we lose more businesses. So in the short term, there's some major hurdles to get through. Over the longer term, I think the jury is still out about what sort of recovery we're going to have. I think people have pretty much ruled out now the V-shaped recovery, and there are some who still think the U-shape is more likely, that we will recover relatively rapidly because the fundamentals are right and certainly stronger in many respects than during the 2009, the previous depression, or recession rather, economic crisis. So, but the other possibility is that this just lingers for more than the next 2 years, 2 or 3 years. And the IMF was recently fairly pessimistic in their assessment. So, yeah, I think the jury is still out. We'll see. Hopefully, it'll be more like a U-shape than an extended fits and starts recovery.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Stephen Loosely asks a question. Peter, how should Australia seek to deepen relations with Indonesia in the wake of the pandemic? I've written, actually in the book, a thought that something Australia should do is talk to Jakarta about invoking the Lombok Treaty with a view to making that the vehicle for Australia to assist Indonesia as it works its way through the crisis. And really what I mean by that is that I think we should use this as an industrial scale opportunity to engage with Indonesia. Once we have solved the problem of personal protective equipment and its production in Australia, the production of ventilators in Australia, I don't think we should stop. I think we should continue to produce that for Indonesia and indeed other Southeast Asian countries. But, make this an opportunity, as John Howard did after the terrible tsunami in 2003 and 4, to kickstart a closer and deeper relationship with Indonesia. And I think the Lombok Treaty would be a way that Indonesia might positively respond to that. Huong, do you want to offer maybe some comments for Stephen on Indonesia-Australia relations in particular?
Yeah, not much more to add on that. I think I've also suggested immediate. Currently, I think there's a lot of need in terms of handling this health crisis. So, if Australia is in the position to help and engage, and also by frequent dialogue and sharing experiences, best practices. For example, among Southeast Asian leaders, they have different ways of communicating, including a WhatsApp group where they share experience live. So that is also helpful because the information, how to deal with large-scale pandemic, as well as the nature of the virus is still very unknown. So any sharing information is a critical and start point for any relationship.
Okay, thank you. So let's go to Tony. Jack asked the question, is the US-China confrontation, and also involving US allies, the dominant force in the world? And is there a realistic alternative? Who'd like to volunteer for that one?
Sure, happy to, Peter. Could you just repeat the question, sorry?
Yes, the question is the US-China confrontation necessarily a dominant force in the world, and is there a realistic alternative?
Yeah, I think it is absolutely the dominant force in the world. I mean, notwithstanding the fact that Robert's pointed to a far more existential crisis that we're staring at right now of climate change, I think that in terms of geopolitical terms, the US-China confrontation is really front and center of what's going to shape our lives for the next foreseeable future. So I can't see an alternative to that, but I don't think it's necessarily. I see we've also had questions around is conflict inevitable? I don't think conflict is inevitable. In fact, the overriding assumption for a very long time was that there'd be a peaceful integration, and I think if we band together and collectively nudge China and the CCP in the direction of behaving decently in its international relations and also with its own people domestically, I think we have a prospect of having being able to come to an accommodation that's reasonable. So yeah, I think it is going to be front and center, and I think it doesn't necessarily have to be a conflictual one.
Peter, this is Robert. Can I follow up both on the comment on China? both of which are critical for Australia and for the world in terms of climate impacts and mitigation. So China is absolutely fundamental to any global effort to reduce greenhouse gases. So we can't really achieve our objectives on the greenhouse gases front without engaging China multilaterally. So that's one point. The second is on Indonesia. Although our policy, if you look at our aid policy, your point, Peter, about engaging more using this crisis or following the crisis to engage more comprehensively in our immediate region, our climate efforts have focused pretty much for understandable reasons on the Pacific Island states. But if we actually, which is important to continue for historical reasons and other reasons. But the real impact on regional impacts of climate change of direct interest and strategic relevance to Australia will be in our immediate north, Indonesia, the Philippines, maritime Southeast Asia. The impacts there are going to be enormous. Indonesia is one of the most populous countries in the world. It's had some internal political challenges. This is a huge risk over the longer term for Australia. And we need to engage with them, maybe using the vehicle of the pandemic as a way of maybe stepping up that engagement, but climate, there are very sound reasons for doing that on the climate front as well.
That's a good point. So my ASPI controllers have told me that you can rank questions by upvotes, and by doing that, we get Still Garrigan asking a question. Lots of questions here about AU-China, but what about the impact, if any, on Australia-US relations? The US isn't covering itself in glory with COVID-19, and I think that has to be true. I said on a radio program the other day that I think a lesson for Australia coming out of this is that we cannot put ourselves into a dependent relationship with anyone, really, including the United States. I think we have to be prepared to think for ourselves and act for ourselves. And that partly goes to some of those questions about sovereignty, but it also goes to how we can build, trusting ties with our neighbours. I think I share Fergus's view that values is a good basis on which to drive trusting relationships, and really that is going to point us in the direction of stable democracies as being obvious partners for it. My personal view, I spent a career working very hard to strengthen and deepen the American alliance. I hope that it remains, and I think it certainly will be there after the US election, or maybe two presidential elections. So I think it's important to understand there's a difference between what is currently going through the American system versus the structural differences that we see in dealing with a Leninist state like China. That's my perspective. Anyone want to offer some brief comments on Australia-US relations from the other speakers?
Peter, I was just going to add one thing here. I mean, to me, what's really fascinating about the current dynamics with the US-Australia relationship is the viscosity of those ties that you mentioned. So there's all these people who over generations have built up really close personal links with all different arms of the US government, civil society, business. And even when you have a disruption at the top level, there's all of these ties still remain there. So I think it's a really interesting lesson in terms of, how those micro ties that build up really provide a lot of ballast to relationships. And you contrast that with relationships where we just have, for example, very strong trading ties, but they're superficial in other areas. You can see how those networks of ties really do add a lot of ballast that has the potential to ride a relationship even when you go through a 10-year rough patch or whatever it is. So I think that's just a really interesting.
And we're still in pretty good standing in the White House as well, though, Fergus. I mean, for all of President Trump's unhappiness with the European allies, with the Canadians, Brand Australia still works pretty effectively in all parts of Washington, it seems to me. Which is not to say that we can necessarily find ourselves aligned on policy. That's where the problems emerge, I think, with the White House. Let me go to the next question that had 16 upvotes. Max Heinrich, there's a lot of talk about breaking supply chains that lead to China. What are the realistic options or opportunities around this broad question? Who would like to have a go on that?
The only comment I would add to that is that it depends which supply chain for what product and activity, because there's some problems that can't be fixed quickly. You can't change tracks and become totally self-sufficient overnight in some areas. There's some questions about strategic minerals, which exist in particular places, but not in others. And so you really have to unpack that, I bet. I think, just to cite a historical example, the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank used to encourage particularly African and Latin American countries not to worry about being able to meet their food supply needs domestically, because they could access their food at more efficiently on the market. And then we went through food security crises in 2010 and 11, in which countries could not purchase food on the market because other countries were hoarding it. So fixing that problem wasn't easy, and many of those countries are actually still rely on imports, but many countries over time fix that problem. But it depends on the product.
But if I could just jump in with one extra bit, I mean, we're doing some research at the moment around the CCP's use of coercive diplomacy and how widespread that is. And one of the implications, I think, of that is that countries do need to think seriously about the fact that they may be, coerced in different ways on key product supply chains that, because this is an increasing, diplomatic tool that they're using. So I think serious countries do have to think about, where they're vulnerable in their supply chains and look at whether there are alternatives until such a point when, collectives of countries can get together and push back against this behaviour, and we can try to, ideally it would stop. But if it doesn't, sort of get a better grasp on, when it's going to be used and in which particular sectors, so that you can take mitigating actions.
Can I just plug in that we do have a chapter on the global supply chain by one of our colleagues, Marcus Hellier, and perhaps that would be another webinar in terms of in our activities promoting this report.
All right, thanks. Marcus will appreciate the plug there. Huong. Tony McCormick asks, the bushfire crisis showed a very fractious relationship between federal and state governments. The response to COVID-19 has been the opposite, with the National Cabinet providing closer cooperation and strong leadership. Does COVID provide the for a new interpretation of federation?
That's a really interesting question from Tony. I guess one thing I've observed in big disasters, and this is a really big one, but in general in disasters, tends to be a brief opportunity to make really substantive changes. And when the political will is high right after a big disaster, but it quickly fades away. We saw that, in each of the previous pandemic threats, bird flu, the H1N1, SARS, and MERS, there's interest, funding, and then it fades away as the political interest in the crisis seems to diminish. So it will be interesting to see whether, I would expect this to follow, even though this is a much bigger, larger scale disaster, to follow that pattern. On the other hand, with climate change increasing the frequency and severity of disasters, we can expect more disasters, national scale disasters of the type we saw this last season with the bushfires. And so the changes in governance linked to our responses will be absolutely fundamental. So I think this has moved us a bit further in the direction of kind of a slightly different interpretation of federation. The Prime Minister's own announcements about declaring national emergencies and a role for the ADF, increasing role for the ADF, moves us in that direction. And as we have further disasters of this sort of scale and larger, I think that is where we will be heading ultimately.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I mean, I too worry a little bit that we will be back to sort of politics as usual when some sense of normality returns. But therefore, the issue will really be, is there a window of opportunity that we can use the National Cabinet and the personal connections that I think have been rather successfully built between the PM and premiers and territory leaders to address, not just economic reconstruction, which I guess will be the first thing that I want to talk about, but then climate after that, Rob. It seems to me that if there was one big question that we have to get right as a federation, it will be climate. So I'll be sort of watching for warnings and indicators as to whether or not that spirit of cooperation can last long enough to address some other deep policy areas. Well, folks, we've got about a minute to go. I'm afraid I've failed you as a moderator because there are many, many more questions which we won't be able to answer at this meeting. But as Huong has said, what we're going to do is we'll have another podcast next week with 3 more authors from After Covid-19, Vol 1. So I hope you'll all come back and put those questions back to a different crew of ASPI researchers for their responses. In the meantime, it's been great fun. Thank you very much for coming on board to listen. And now we'll say farewell from ASPI.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, audience.